Hello, everyone. My name is Asaf Baltov. I work for the Wikimedia Foundation at the Community Development Team. And I'm here to talk today about conflict resolution from a collective responsibility angle. Can we see the slides? Can we put them on the screen? Thank you. Yes. So, I have a talk that I gave several years ago, several times at several conferences, called Conflict Engagement for Humans. And unfortunately, there's no recording of it, but there are slides on Commons. And it focused on conflict engagement from an individual perspective. And I don't want to repeat that material, even though obviously some of you haven't heard that talk. For the benefit of those who have, I took a different approach this time. And this time I want to tackle the subject from a collective perspective and to discuss how we can respond to conflict as a community, as a collective, especially administrators of a wiki. So I've divided my talk into three brief parts. First, the environment in which conflicts happen, then how we can resolve conflicts by ending them, and then something about a culture of experimentation in the service of conflict resolution. So we must start with some bleak facts. Conflict is a constant of the human condition. Some conflict is preventable. I want to acknowledge that some isn't. Right? Some people just behave in ways that generate conflict around them, and it's not preventable. Some external conditions cause conflict that is difficult to prevent. So I don't want to suggest that all conflict is preventable, and when there's conflict, something has gone wrong, someone screwed up. Some conflict just happens. That said, the most effective way to resolve the conflict is to prevent it from arising in the first place. But because some conflict will happen on all wikis, indeed in all groups of humans, not just wikis, because it is a constant of the human condition, and because some conflict can also cause permanent damage, right? People walk away, people rage quit, people burn out, people are hurt even if they stay, and some of that damage is permanent. We have an interest as a community, as a collective, to prevent as much preventable conflict as possible. I hope none of this is controversial. Now, different wikis will not experience the same levels of conflict. That's a fact. I have perhaps had a good perspective on this, visiting a lot of different wiki communities, discussing things with a lot of Wikipedians from all over the world. So I know the situation in many different wikis, whereas most of you, most of us, contribute on one wiki, two wikis, but don't know a lot of them. I can tell you that the levels of conflict differ. All wikis have conflict. All of them have the same kinds of conflict, but different levels, meaning there's a different amount of conflict. And there are the conflicts sort of last different amounts of time. There's a different way of handling conflict on different wikis, even though they're all written by the same very problematic species, humans. I cannot recommend humans as a species to write Wikipedia. However, we're stuck with them. So what makes the difference in levels of conflict between wikis? I want to suggest to you that there are quite a few factors that affect the likelihood of conflict, and once it happens, the duration of the conflict and the intensity, how heated it gets. And some of these are constant or very, very difficult to change. Some of these, for example, could be broad culture, right? They could come from the culture of the people writing the wiki. And here, by the way, English Wikipedia is special because it is global, There's no one culture that absolutely dominates it. Even the large cultures like American culture, there's many, many American Wikipedians on English Wikipedia. Still, they do not permeate English Wikipedia because everybody contributes to English Wikipedia from every corner of the world. So it's less felt on English Wikipedia. But if we take smaller languages where there's a much more homogeneous collective of editors editing it, national attitudes, cultural attitudes can certainly come into things, and that can be expressed, for example, in anti-LGBT bias, right? There are whole countries and whole cultures that are still fundamentally anti-LGBT, and some of that will necessarily bleed over into the wiki because it's everywhere, it's in the society. That's an example of a constant pressure or constant factor affecting the wiki that is worth struggling to change. Another example is copyright law. That is not universally respected all over the world. There are whole countries where copyright law is scoffed at, is ignored in practice, not formally, but in practice by everyone, and is basically unenforced. And yet, we Wikimedians do enforce it. And we need to sort of go against the grain, go against the mainstream of our cultures to enforce it on the wikis because we have to. So these are just examples of outside pressure or the environment in which conflict can arise. And I hope it's easy to imagine that if you live in a culture where copyright law just isn't a thing, and you are trying to convince people that, yes, we do have to follow copyright law, it does matter, and I am deleting this image that you uploaded, even though it's really, really nice, can get themselves into conflict. Because people, because of that cultural attitude, will just fail to see why you're being so pig-headed, why you're being so stubborn about this thing nobody cares about, like copyright. So these are examples of things that aren't really your fault or this person's fault. They are coming from outside. But I want to suggest to you, there are other things that are part of the environment of the wiki that are easier to change and are in fact the result of your actions collectively, the community's actions. And they can be the result of neglect or the result of laziness, things that we know we need to fix or change and just haven't. And so here are some examples of some of these environmental conflict factors that are easier to change, like outdated help pages or incomplete help pages. We all know they're there, and none of us feels usually that today is a good day to revamp the help pages, right? We just don't. We know it's there. We know it needs to be done. We don't do it. Unclear policy pages, ambiguous policy pages, missing policy pages. We know, all of us know about our home wikis of all kinds of things that should be defined, should be better explained, given better examples. But again, it never feels like a good day to muck around with a policy page, and people will argue, and who needs this? An even more serious factor that creates conflict in wiki environments is lax enforcement, meaning too weak enforcement, or selective enforcement. Selective enforcement is toxic. It ruins communities. If we see people commit transgressions, commit errors on wiki or violations of policy, and we don't do anything about it because they've been around forever or because we personally like them, we are exercising selective enforcement, and that is poison to the wiki, to the atmosphere. On the other hand, overzealous enforcement, also known as newbie biting, right? Like being very, very proactive and impatient with mistakes, with learning, with imperfect contributions, also creates a high conflict environment. Again, none of this should be terribly surprising or controversial, I hope. So here's the idea I want to pitch to you today, and that is collective ownership of conflict resolution. And in my observation, all too often, the problem of resolving a conflict remains the problem of the people directly involved in the conflict and of the single admin who happened to try and resolve the problem. But what if, and this is especially true again in smaller wikis, what if that burden were more actively carried by all admins, or the admin class, if you will, what if that were more actively curated? The burden was more actively distributed among people. And that might take all kinds of shapes, and I don't have a perfect answer here, but I'm inviting you to think about intervening in pairs, for example, rather than as single admins. Maybe taking turns, doing some kind of round robin among admins. Now it's your turn, now it's my turn, to deal with things so that people don't feel overtaxed at resolving conflicts. What if we have some admin council? It doesn't have to be all the admins at once, but what if we create little councils and then they take turns, those councils, to resolve things? All of these are just options, and there are others to not make it a single admin's problem. The reason this matters is that it's natural to want to stay out of conflict, but especially if you have strong views yourself about this topic, or if it's already gone ugly, right? If the conflict is already full of verbal violence or shaming or bullying, who wants that, right? Who needs to get involved with that? So it's very natural to want to stay out of it, but there is a cost to collective avoidance, right? Every individual admin is, of course, your volunteers after all. Nobody can force you to get involved. But if we as a collective avoid dealing with conflict, or selectively avoid, if we avoid dealing with conflict with popular people, there is a cost, because the repressed conflicts breed resentment. And resentment is a very powerful corrosive force on the community. It slowly eats up at the social fabric of the community. And this is seen in many communities, including English Wikipedia. And it has a chilling effect on other people intervening, because passively it sends the message that de facto some behaviors are tolerated. Once a perhaps younger or less experienced admin sees that none of the veteran admins are enforcing against this person, they get the passive implicit message that you don't enforce on that person, even when they misbehave. And that is a chilling effect. So what can we do to improve? I want to suggest some basic ideas. First, we need to make sure we keep the admin ranks fresh and able. And this is especially relevant to English Wikipedia, where it is harder to become an admin than most places. It's also, adminship is for life, which is unhealthy in my opinion. But once we try to not create an oligarchy, right? There's a famous Wikipedia article called The Iron Law of the Oligarchy, where all pseudo-democratic institutions end up de facto with a kind of oligarchy. So we need to break the oligarchy to the degree we can, or at least keep breaking it because it keeps forming, and proactively invite fresh admins, recruit fresh admins, and make it more reasonable to become an admin. And also to offer tutoring to potential admins who maybe are lacking some specific capacity. Maybe someone could make a great admin, but they don't know X and Y. So maybe someone could take it upon themselves to teach them X and Y so that they can become admins. And I also want to suggest that admin intervention is not about picking the winning side. That's not the goal of admin intervention. The goal of admin intervention is to de-escalate unproductive conflict and resolve it so that productive work can resume. That is the goal. We're trying to stop unproductive conflict and get back to productive work. While we do that, we may discover that one or more parties violated norms, and then there should be some kind of enforcement of certain sanctions on those who did. But the goal is not to say, you're right, you're wrong, that's it. The goal is to get back to work as soon as possible. To which I want to offer a perhaps surprising idea. I want to offer you this assertion. We should strive to resolve conflict by ending it, rather than ending conflict by resolving it. This may be difficult to parse. It suggests the view that the fact that conflict is going on is itself causing damage, more damage usually than possibly ending it with an unjust resolution, with the wrong side winning. Now, my psychic powers tell me some of you are bristling at this right now and saying, what? Of course it matters. Justice matters. We should end things with the right side winning. I want to suggest to you that instead of keeping the conflict going until the subject of the conflict is somehow resolved, one side convinced the other, one side forgave the other or something, we should instead resolve the conflict by putting an end to it, even an artificial end to it. Collectively, as a community, this makes sense, even though the individuals in the conflict will probably find it very frustrating, especially the individual that feels that the decision is against them or didn't go their way. And by the way, both sides can feel that way, as we know. But from our community perspective, from a collective perspective, it is a powerful idea that we put an end to the conflict, and that's the resolution. Now, I want to suggest to you, we already agree with this, because if you've been around the wikis for any amount of time, you must have already lost some notability discussion, for example, right? It didn't go your way. The article was deleted or kept when you thought it should be the other way around. After it was resolved, you still felt that was the wrong decision to make, but you got on with the work, right? Ultimately, I mean, you're still here, you're still around, you're still a Wikimedian. So presumably, despite the fact this argument didn't go your way and you think a mistake was made, you got over it and you got back to work. So if you think about that, you'll realize you already agree with this principle. We don't argue until one side convinces the other. Sometimes we have to cut things short. So how do we do that? Well, one way to do it is to decide deadlines and have default outcomes. And to some extent, that's what we do with, processes like articles for deletion, right? There is a deadline, and at that deadline, a decision is made one way or another. And defining the default outcome in advance helps settle the conflict, because everybody knows what's going to happen in a week, in a month, whatever, if there's no consensus. Voting is another way to cut through the endless arguments and settle something. It's not a good way. Votes are evil, I think, but it is a method to end a conflict. Another way to end a conflict is actually to transcend the concrete case that we're talking about and to create or revise the policy that may prevent conflict from happening again. And we can also create deliberative bodies that make binding decisions, like arbitration committees that some wikis have, and some wikis even find them to work. And there are other ways. Now, which of these ways would work best in your wiki? This is where we get to my final topic, which is a culture of experimentation. I want to suggest to you that these days, a lot of things feel less changeable than they used to be, because in the early days, we made up the rules as we went, but wikis need to keep changing. And when the stakes are high, like when we're talking about core policy or something, determining which change is desirable becomes harder, and we tend to argue in circles until everybody's exhausted and we don't agree on change. If we want to talk about notability, if we want to talk about newbies, if we want to talk about oral citations, everybody's got an opinion. How do we actually make a decision? I want to suggest to you that experiments can cut through these Gordian knots, these circular arguments, and to encourage you to conduct experiments in your wikis. But the key is to be disciplined. So the experiment has to have goals, has to have hypotheses defined in advance, a specific timeline, and a specific post-experiment action one way or another. For example, if we want to retain more new contributors, we might come up with these hypotheses. We might come up with others as well. We know that failure decreases motivation. We know that conflict decreases motivation. We know that recognition boosts motivation. If we recognize good contributions, that's easier to do than preventing people from running up against conflict or failure. So what if we take the easy part and recognize good contribution? What if we make an experiment of identifying promising newbies, for example, using the tool Quarry, we can make queries, etc., and leave notes of appreciation on people's talk page. That's the experiment. And then we do this for 6 months, and we compare the retention of the appreciated users to some baseline rate of retention that we measured in advance. Then we can decide if it shows an increase in retention, let's make it a permanent practice, this appreciation. If not, we can stop and try some other example. This is a very easy experiment to make, and yet most wikis have not done this experiment, and instead are arguing whether or not we should do this sort of thing. One last